Well, good evening. I think we'll go ahead and call this hearing to order. And want to thank everybody for giving an hour or so of your time on a beautiful June afternoon in Columbus. I'm Councilmember Shannon Harden, and I am chairing this committee, and the purpose of this hearing is to discuss the best practices for districting as part of the Charter Review Committee's recommendations. I want to thank my colleagues, Councilmember Elizabeth Brown, Councilmember Cinziano, and other colleagues for engaging this evening. I know folks may come in and out as the hearing progresses. City staff will present a model for drawing residency requirement boundaries based upon good government group's recommendations and explain how this fits within our charter structure. After hearing from city staff, council members will have the opportunity to ask questions. We will then hear from Chief Counsel Josh Cox from the Columbus City Attorney's Office. After Mr. Cox's remarks, we will open the floor for public comment. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes in order to assure we hear from everyone who would like to speak. Before we dive in, I'd like to take a step back and provide some context for this conversation tonight. The Charter Review Committee was an opportunity to review how to best serve all residents in every corner of our city. This diverse and bipartisan committee conducted a comprehensive analysis on the structure and governance of Columbus City Council. After hearing from the community, examining national best practices, and facilitating a citywide conversation about the structure of City Council, the Charter Review Committee came forward with a set of recommendations. In short, the committee recommended the following changes to the Columbus City Charter. First, to increase the number of council members from 7 to 9 members. Second, to shift elections from at-large field races to at-large by-place races, where candidates who live in the same area would run against each other for the seat that are voted on citywide. And lastly, to extend the timeline for vacancy appointments from 30 days to 45 days to accommodate at least one public hearing. I'd like to note that there are other recommendations that do not require charter change. We discussed those recommendations, including those do not require a charter change at a public hearing on June 14th. And certainly, as I have throughout this process and before I engaged while the Charter Committee was meeting, encourage folks to go back and kind of follow the charter hearings. They are available online, and I have asked Columbus TV to replay some of those because this is a weighty topic, and just hearing all the dialogue and all the presentations, I think is important. The Charter Review Committee did not outline a process for drawing the boundaries for residency requirements. Tonight we will hear and discuss potential districting processes based on best practices. I look forward to the conversation. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Mr. Edward Johnson, Director of Legislative Affairs for the Columbus City Council, and following Mr. Johnson, Mr. Stephen Sayer, Director of Special Projects in the Mayor's Office.
Thank you, Chair Harden and members of Council, for the opportunity to present on a possible method of districting in the City of Columbus. The Chair asked staff to look at the best practices presented to the Charter Review Committee and devise a system for residency requirements that would be consistent with the committee's recommendations to apply districts to Columbus. The last time the City of Columbus had district boundaries was 103 years ago, and that process was markedly different from what best practices currently dictate. Those best practices have been gathered from groups and organizations such as Fair Vote, the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law, the Congressional Research Service, Ballotpedia, and the Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, each of which has addressed districting and apportionment at significant length and breadth. I've broken down the process into 3 parts: membership, criteria, and adoption. Membership, based on the emerging best practice, staff recommends a citizens commission be impaneled to perform the work of drawing districts. Citizens commissions are the second most popular form of districting, where a group of citizens are appointed to draw one or more plans and submit their final work product to the legislative authority for ultimate approval. Consistent with other commissions enshrined in the city charter, staff proposes a 5-member districting commission. 2 members would be appointed by City Council by 2/3 vote, 2 members would be appointed by the mayor, and the 5th member would serve as the chair and would be jointly appointed by the council president and the mayor. Members of the commission must be qualified electors of the City of Columbus and may not be currently elected officials, registered lobbyists, a candidate for elective office, or a city employee. Staff also recommends that the appointing authority reserve the right to remove members for neglect of duty, gross misconduct, or inability to just discharge his or her duties to provide a full committee that can operate. Lastly, the districting commission ought to be a public body subject to all open meetings laws, and this would include making the data used to draw the districts publicly available for inspection. Moving on to criteria, consistent with the best practices that were observed, once constituted, staff would recommend that the commission use the following criteria in drawing the boundaries. Having districts comply with federal and state laws, including the Voting Rights Act, be of roughly equal population with a deviation of 1% allowed, be geographically contiguous without intersecting lines, as practicable, be geographically compact and not bypass areas of population for more distant populations, as practicable, use the boundaries of existing election precincts, council districts, and geographically identifiable boundaries such as roads and waterways. And lastly, as practical, maintain the geographic integrity of existing neighborhoods and communities of interest. Regarding frequency of line drawing, staff has observed that it's a commonly accepted practice to redistrict following the decennial federal census every 10 years. This practice allows the districting authority to work with the most accurate and up-to-date information and create the fairest and most efficient maps possible. Lastly, I would be remiss if I did not comment on a criteria that was intentionally omitted from the aforementioned list of best practices, that of political consideration in drawing districts. Since the charter was adopted 103 years ago, it is dictated that municipal elections in the city operate in a nonpartisan fashion. That is to say that candidates for city council, mayor, city attorney, and city auditor appear on the ballot without political party identification. Accordingly, many best practices require that apportionment authorities draw districts so as not to favor one group over another using elections data. However, our nonpartisan elections render such considerations moot at this time. Lastly, adoption. As mentioned above, citizens commissions that perform the work of line drawing typically submit their final work product to the legislative authority for final approval. Staff recommends that the districting commission create 3 plans to submit to council, and council approve one of the plans or reject all 3 plans without amendment. Approval or disapproval would come via ordinance, and should council grant its approval, the maps would be effective at the following municipal election. Regarding best practices related to transparency, the commission should hold a minimum of 9 public meetings in 9 different areas of the city prior to submitting plans to council. Additionally, the commission could make those 3 plans available for public inspection and comment no less than 30 days prior to submission to council. And after submittal, council could have up to 60 days to approve or disapprove a plan. Thank you for the opportunity to present on those best practices, and I'm available to answer questions as I am able.
We'll go ahead with Mr. Sayer, and then we'll, if that's all right with council members, come back and open up for questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Hardin, for the opportunity to offer support for the district proposal to be discussed this evening. Mayor Ginther has been supportive of the citizen-led charter review committee process and continues to support council as you consider common sense proposals to amend the size and structure of council. As you are aware, Columbus voters overwhelmingly rejected a proposed charter amendment to dramatically expand the size and structure of council. In fact, issue 1 lost by the largest margin of any municipal ballot issue in Columbus history. This was the 3rd such defeat for a ward-based system for council, in addition to at least 4 failed attempts to make the ballot over the course of 5 years. In short, Columbus voters have rejected drastic changes and have not shown any new support for such changes during the Charter Review Committee process. Mr. Johnson provided an advanced copy of the districting proposal to Chief Policy Advisor Brian Clark. Mr. Clark agrees that the proposal draws on and follows widely recognized best practices for districting. At the next meeting of this committee, we will provide testimony regarding the specific features of this proposal. In the meantime, on behalf of Mayor Ginther, thank you, Council Members Hardin, Brown, Stinziano, Council President Klein, and all members of Council for taking on this difficult subject.
Thank you, Mr. Sayer. Well, I certainly want to open it up for questions from my colleagues. I kind of want to start at that last point that you were stating, Mr. Sayer, and this question is I think, for Edward. When we say best practices, who are we talking about? What are those institutions or entities that one would look to seek best practices for pulling together a districting group?
Certainly. We looked at, like I said, Fair Vote, the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law, Congressional Research Service, Ballotpedia, Loyola Law School at Los Angeles, because they've produced academic, nonpartisan research to say, we have observed irregularities or perceived unfairness in a lot of processes around the country, and so to remove that and to create the fairest districts, they've produced a body of research that we felt would be very good to look at and follow on in crafting and presenting these best practices to council.
Councilmember Brown.
Thank you, Councilmember Hardin. Mr. Johnson, have you, I know you've been doing a ton of research and looking at how all these various groups kind of analyze effectiveness for practices in local governance. Have you been able to find a functionality score or something, some way to judge the efficiency with which governments work, local governments, the standard of outputs that they have? I mean, it's a kind of vague question, but I just wonder if there's any actual sort of disinterested way to look at that question of highest and best form of local governance.
It's interesting, that question was raised during the Charter Review Committee's deliberations, and staff was able to look into satisfaction metrics by metropolitan area. They weren't necessarily broken down by specific municipal corporations and how they were formed. I would have to go back and look at the exact numbers, but we felt confident in where Columbus fell consistent with our peers. And so I would be more than happy to come get some of that research and share that with the members of council.
Yeah, that would be helpful to see. Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Councilmember Stinziano.
Thank you, Chair Hardin. I have a number of questions. I don't know if you just want me to go now or come back and forth. You tell me if you need me to stop. The first one I have is, you mentioned this is the second most popular form. Why was that determined to be the best? Because there is a more popular form that you presented to the Charter Review. Just curious why this is the direction of your recommendation.
Certainly, Councilmember Stinziano. We observed that districting performed by the legislative authority itself was the most popular form, as in it occurred the most, but we observed that it was a default that fell into many cities' charters to say, when we wrote this, this is how things were done, so we just kind of put that in there and kept it. As cities began to reform their charters or modernize their charters, they seemed to start going in the direction of a citizen commission to increase citizen participation in the process and make it more transparent. And so that's why we describe it as an emerging best practice and observe that it was the second most popular, but it is growing in its popularity.
So part of where I'm struggling is you mentioned best practice entities and didn't cite any other local cities. Yet you're saying you looked at local cities to see what was emerging within them. So did New York School of Law, Ballotpedia, Fair Vote, were they evaluating cities or just more conceptual forms that better redistricting, reapportionment could be occurring under?
Those best practice organizations were speaking conceptually and through an analysis of redistricting at state levels. What we did was we started to take a look at the charters and dates of amendment to see what was going on in a more contemporaneous context.
In the configuration membership, we have the executive involved in selecting 2 members. Is that consistent to have the executive compose some of the membership, or not just the legislative body? I don't know why the members of the council wouldn't be able to select 4 individuals and maybe council president and the mayor choose that 5th. But just curious why the executive's input for the legislative body. And our work at the State House, for example, the executive office holders had an impact, but not the one that was directly vetoing activities of that legislative body.
That was done so based upon other commissions that appear in the city charter and city laws. We observe that that's typically how they're comprised, and so we felt that that would be a consistent way to present a proposal.
And then in your testimony, you mentioned the appointing authority reserves the right. Is that the legislative body? Is that the executive body? Is that in coordination? What would that look like if they decide someone is derelict of their duty?
I would conceive that being the authority that appointed that individual. So if an appointee was the legislative appointee to the commission, that authority would rest with the legislative authority, or vice versa with the executive authority.
One aspect that isn't highlighted in the testimony is the cost. What resources would we provide to this apportioning body? Was that contemplated? I looked at the testimony provided to the committee. I haven't seen what resources are being asked to be provided. Was there a best practice in that regard?
We were not able to observe a best practice on that front, but I would envision costs resulting in a purchase of software for this, and then potentially staffing costs for a districting authority, should it so request that.
2 more questions, Chair. So what happens if the apportionment body doesn't come up with agreement on 3 maps? What activity or what advances forward to the council?
In the event that they were unable to produce a map, my sense would be that should a map already exist, that would be a default. However, without the existence of a map, that was not a foreseen consequence of their deliberations.
And then what if council takes no action? You give them 60 days. What if they decide based on the feedback all 3 maps aren't in the best interest of the citizens of the city?
I would believe that would constitute disapproval of all 3 plans and would kick it back to the districting commission to produce 3 more plans.
Thank you, Councilmember Stenziano. What would be the timeline of not just the districting committee, but when, say, this proposal made it to the ballot and say it passed, what would be our timeline going forward for a district committee to be established and then to then do its work?
Councilmember Harden, it would probably be advisable to do so with the latest census data coming in 2020, with their work, with the census's work possibly being concluded that year or in 2021, hopefully in 2020. Impaneling the districting commission in 2020 would be advisable to complete their work throughout the year, with those maps being effective in 2021 for the primary election.
So we've seen through best practices and engagement from other communities that have gone through this process that it typically takes at least a year. I'm just trying to get a sense of
Councilmember Chair Harden, I would say that as conceived, this process would give the districting commission 9 months to complete their work, and then 60 days for council to approve or disapprove the plans. And so that would give about 11 months of total timeline if everything went as long as it could.
Thank you. And Looking at other peer cities that have gone through this process, where does the hang up lie? Where if there's a contentious point in this process of drawing districts in pulling folks together, what part of that process does that happen, or is
in the most friction in the process from the community? Well, Chair Harden, I would say that that is probably observed when preliminary plans are released and ultimately a commission has to produce 9 or 11 or 13 districts or however many districts are expected to be produced, and occasionally neighborhoods or communities of interest have to be divided in some way to make the map make sense. And so one thing that could be put into the proposal is when that's done, asking the commission to produce an explanation for putting a line through a community. Why was that done? Was it done in a best interest? Was it done for the sake of math to make the districts of equal population? And so when that's done without explanation, oftentimes that can cause friction amongst the community to try to understand why it was done and what was done.
And since this proposal is a kind of a hybrid of systems where it is boundaries, but it's really residence requirements for council members, what is the baseline in terms of what administratively we would be holding ourselves to in creating this districting council to administer these districts? Because it seems different from if this was a purely ward representative recommendation, that the considerations of size and demographics of a given area would certainly come into mind if folks were only voting for their representative. So what is the baseline that we hold ourselves to in terms of creating this district? Is this purely administrative in drawing districts, or is there some basis that we have to follow that other cities follow as well in terms of pulling together a districting committee?
I hope that I'm able to answer the question as I understand it. You're asking so the baseline of legality in terms of how we're pulling these districts together, council member?
I think, I guess my question is, we're talking about residency requirements throughout our community. Does that make it different in terms of what we have to hold ourselves to in terms of administratively setting up a districting committee versus a purely ward representative structure of a council in terms of districting committees?
Certainly, council member, once again, if I'm understanding it, I think that you're getting to maybe what are the legal implications in that case. And regarding that, I would defer to the city attorney's office for an answer.
Well, I guess as chair, I guess I could have just pushed it over to the next. If there are no other initial questions for staff, can I turn that over to Mr. Cox? And you can give any presentation, but and I can clarify just a little bit more of the question.
No, Chair Harden, members of council, I think I understand your question. It's a very valid point because I think that it is viewed differently when it's a voting district you're drawing as opposed to a candidate district, basically, residency requirement. And I think governments have a lot more leeway in their residency requirements for candidates than they would in voting districts. So I think it's a good idea to try and draw the districts in conformance with the standards that have been developed over the years for under the Voting Rights Act and all that law that has evolved around that. But it's probably not as important in a situation where it's affecting the candidates more so than the folks that are voting, since it's overlaying an at-large voting pool.
Thank you. Sure. Just in general, as as we would bring some a administrative process for setting up districts like this to the city attorney, I guess you kind of went into it with that answer, but what are the cautions that a city would need to look out for in terms of creating a process that would most stand up to legal scrutiny?
Well, I don't think it's so much the process as the end result, how the districts are drawn. I think the process is, a policy matter for, as much of this is, for the city and city council because of home rule, and that gives us broad authority to determine the form and structure of our city government. And as a matter of local self-government, it's not subject to the whims of the General Assembly, so we pretty much have the latitude as a matter of policy to determine how we're going to structure, not just structure council, but determine how that's going to be determined as the membership.
Thank you. Thank you. Any additional questions from my colleagues? At this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. Because the committee recommendation would impact various elements of city structure, actually, I think we can skip any further questions. I'm going to actually open it up for public comment. Again, this process is best advised when we have as much community engagement as possible. And so I appreciate the folks that came out this evening to provide public comment. Again, as a reminder, all speakers have 3 minutes. I would ask you to state your name, your address, and if you represent any organizations. The first speaker this evening is Mr. Joe Motiel.
Chairman Harden, members of council Brown and Stinziano, Joe Motil, 167 West Cook Road in Columbus. I don't think I've ever read such a report that was so pathetically flawed in how it came to its recommendations, especially after how much information was presented to this committee by the public. As someone who has entered through these chamber doors, speaking on behalf of neighborhood concerns for nearly 30 years now, the influence peddling, a lack of city council members siding with citizens' concerns over parking development, infrastructure improvements, and basic quality of life issues has increased immeasurably over the last 20 years. Unlimited campaign contributions from the development community, law firms, and their lawyers who represent clients for zoning variances in both this chambers and the BZA, and the leverage and strength from members of the Columbus Partnership places the concerns of most Columbus residents as insignificant and without a voice. As stated in the final report, Columbus had a 12-district, 3-at-large makeup of city council in the early 1900s and as many as 38 council members at one point in the 1800s. In 1914, the charter called for a current 7 at-large membership. What the report conveniently excludes is the reason why this occurred. The Anglo-Irish white businessman did not care much for a bunch of German, Italians, Poles, and other Eastern European immigrants and minorities having any input in city policy. Even the city of Columbus's law director at that time, George Jones, stated, quote, "The laboring men will not be benefited or represented in a council of 7 men elected at large, 4 of whom at least will be corporation handpicked and will vote as the corporations dictate against the interest of the men who work." And this statement continues to hold true over 100 years later, with not just 4 who will be handpicked as corporations dictate, but all 7. A May 1st, 2015 paper published by the Harvard Business School titled "The Columbus Partnership" reads, Wexner recalled the origins of the Columbus Partnership. One day in the late 1980s, J.W. Wolf called me into his office and asked if I wanted to join him as one of 3 or 4 other people who decides what happens in town, like who's mayor or where the highways go. I said, no way, not with that few of people, and I left his office. Within an hour, my banker called me up, said I was crazy, told me to call JW immediately and apologize and accept his offer. I refused. Further encouragement from Governor Voinovich led Wexner to partner with John F. Wolf and convene what would become the partnership. In conclusion, by allowing all voters in the city to vote for each of the 9 representatives in each district would only exacerbate the current lack of representation by city council members and further diminish our voices while strengthening the stronghold and power of city council over its citizens. The recommendation of 9 districts is really nothing more than an increased at large system that continues to dilute the voting power of blacks and is clearly discriminatory in its nature, as spelled out in Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that was amended in 1982. If our makeup of city council is not changed into a true district at-large system, you will be undoubtedly facing a lawsuit from the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Motil, for your testimony. Any colleagues have any questions? Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Jason Sneed. Thank you, Mr. Sneed.
My name is Jason Sneed. I represent the 2,300 AFSCME employees for the City of Columbus here at 1771 Joyce Avenue. I believe you had the pleasure of speaking with my president. I serve as the vice president of the local. In August, we supported the defeat of this council to going larger, and going to award system. Exactly the same thing that's going on here. We're going to award system. You can sugarcoat it, but it's still what it is. I believe you had the opportunity to speak with President Moore either last week or this week. And I think history repeats itself. If you look through the history, we've had this before. They done away with it. This is where we're at now. Are we going to spend the time and effort to do away with it again? There was a reason. There should be a reason. Why are we repeating ourselves? More importantly, we have seen what happens with districts in the state and in the U.S. Senate races. I didn't hear anything about income making the determining factor. Political has a choice. Those people that we appoint or the city council appoints to make this election drawing, what influences are they going to have on the outside? More importantly, this report that came to you, you asked for recommendations from them to do. I have yet to see any solid recommendation to city council what we should do with the city charter. It's, we're leaving it up to city council. We're leaving it up to city council. You're asking city council to make the decision of their own seat. This report is inadequate, and it should be sent back to have a different review to be done. That is all I have for you.
Thank you, Mr. Sneed, for your comments. I greatly appreciate it. I want to make sure, though, that also that folks have the full report, and for everybody, this is about community conversation. We started a conversation last year. We said that we would pull together a committee that would go across the city to engage and would come back to council with recommendations. And so this is fulfilling the rest of that promise in terms of having a community-wide conversation. So I appreciate your comments, and likewise everyone who's speaking this evening. Next is Ms. Laura Tompkins. Ms. Laura, just a reminder, you have 3 minutes, and ask you to state your name, your address, and any organization you may represent.
Okay. Quick question before the timer starts. I have a clarifying question and then about 3 minutes of comments. Is it possible to do both?
And we will take the liberty to answer your question at the end of your statement, if that's okay.
Okay. Well, the question is just, I would like somebody to speak to how this would affect competitiveness in the election process. So how many names would be on a voter's primary ballot and how many names would be on the general ballot? You can answer that. But my name is Laura Tompkins. I am a resident of the Hilltop. I live at 8 North Ogden Avenue. I also work at the casino on the west side, and I'm the president of the United Steelworkers local there that represents employees. I won't comment in detail on how districts should be drawn and by whom, other than to say we expect an independent and impartial body to do it, not political insiders, and that districts should not be gerrymandered so that they give fair representation to all sides of the city. But I worry that we're being deliberately led into the weeds today, and council is still ignoring the larger questions that brought us here in the first place. So I'll take my time to remind you why many people are still not satisfied with the status quo and won't be satisfied with this proposal. For too long, this body has been run like a private country club instead of a democratic institution. For decades, members have retired strategically midterm in order to handpick their successors, which effectively sidesteps the democratic process and gives council members an incumbency advantage coming the next election. The entire body and the mayor then fundraise strategically in order to funnel money to weaker members and keep the club intact. Point 2, it is still prohibitively expensive for most neighborhood leaders to run for office. If we keep voting at large and we have zero meaningful campaign finance regulations, only millionaires or candidates with millionaire donors will be able to run for citywide campaigns. And finally, the Democrats have gotten lazy and fallen into the pocket of big business instead of supporting progressive policies. And they don't have to do better because our council system and the fact that it's broken now means they don't have to. I'm a working person, a union woman, and a progressive. So it insults me personally when people like me are labeled Trumpians or in bed with the Koch brothers as a ploy to scare voters away from good governance reforms. You have had control of the city for a very long time, so why don't we have more to show for it? Like I said, I work at the casino and I see how much money comes into public coffers in taxes. Why are we using our tax dollars for corporate bailouts like the Nationwide Arena instead of fixing our schools like was promised? Why are we one of the last cities our size to get a recycling program? Why aren't we more serious about raising the minimum wage? Why don't we care that our police kill more black citizens per capita than any other city? And why doesn't council support a citizens review board for the police department? Why aren't we doing anything about the perpetual lack of affordable housing and the rising cost of rent and home ownership in our urban neighborhoods? The list goes on, but it's easy to make, and that's the problem. The proposal on the table today is baby steps at best towards correcting these ills, and until we see proposals that show real choice for Columbus voters at election time and get serious about campaign finance reform, I feel that you aren't serious about putting the democracy back in our local institutions or giving all of our neighborhoods a voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to ask Mr. Johnson to speak to the question posed by Ms. Tompkins at the beginning of her presentation around competitiveness and if we explored how competitive this type of a system versus any other structure would be.
Chair Harden, thank you for the opportunity to offer a response. The Charter Review Committee did request metrics on competitiveness, which we broke down to mean 3 separate variables under the various systems of council organization. Contestedness, so does a person face an actual contest or do they go through uncontested to win their seat? Margin of victory and the percentage of incumbents who lose, and we did this across all 62 peer cities. It was not a longitudinal analysis, it was a static analysis of the elections in those cities. And so what we observed was that at-large field races, as Columbus currently has, constituted the most contested form of election. However, at-large by place, where you'll see an at-large seat and then you'll see a second at-large seat, so it's not a field, the ballot is split, so at-large seat A and then at-large seat B constituted the second most contested form of government, with ward field, ward by place, and pure wards constituting the bottom 3 of contested elections. Margin of victory was lowest in at-large field. That is to say, the margin between the last winner and the first loser was lowest in at-large field, and then second lowest in at-large by place, where we, once again, we see at-large seat A, at-large seat B. And then lastly, we saw that incumbents lose the most in at-large by place systems. And so with those metrics of competitiveness, we observed that the at-large races were always the most competitive, And then once we broke them down into subsets, the field at large took 2 of the metrics for competitiveness, and the at large by place was second in those 2, whereas at large by place was the top metric in the one variable of incumbents losing. And so that was very important in the deliberations of the Charter Review Committee in terms of looking at different systems.
Councilmember Brown.
The at-large by place system, which you said ranked second most competitive, right? If I'm hearing you correctly, right? How many cities have that, though?
So what we were able to do, because many cities have different forms of hybrids, we were able to say that we were able to look at a specific race in a city where they had a single seat that was run at large citywide, and we were able to take that race into account despite the fact that maybe they have wards in that city, but we were able to classify those differently. And so we did find that there were many cities. I would have to go back and look through the constituent pieces of data to get you the exact answer of how many cities on the index did, but we can get that for you.
Okay. And then the second thing is, I think Ms. Tompkins' question was also about how it would appear on the ballot, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Currently on the ballot, I'm sure as you know, the council race is one race, and you'll see many names there. In a primary election, if 4 seats are up for election, you may see 8, you'll see 8 or more on the primary. That's to say 2 people for each seat, and it serves as an elimination primary. So you could see anywhere between 8 and infinity in theory. The elimination primary would take the general election down to 8 names appearing on the ballot in the general election. For this, you would see 9 seats, 9 separate races on the ballot. In the primary, should there be 3 or more candidates, you will see that race appear on the primary, with the elimination primary still applying to say we're going to take this down to 2 individuals for the general election. And then on the general, you would still see the 9 individual races, and you would still be asked to choose one in all 9 races, as opposed to choose 9 in a giant field ballot. If that answer, I hope that's clear. We can provide pictures if that is more helpful as well. I know it's hard to explain with words.
Yeah. I think that, I think that it is the clarity around this conversation is key. And so if we are able to more clearly explain, be that in a graphic of how this would look on a potential ballot, I think that would be helpful if we could get that information to the public. Next, I'd like to invite Kayla Merchant. Just a reminder, state your name and address and any organization you may represent.
Hi, my name is Kayla Merchant, and I'm representing myself, and I live at 451 East Sycamore, Apartment D. So first of all, thank you guys for your time tonight. It's very appreciated. I'm here representing myself, although we've interacted in various capacities over the years, but I'm here as a 10-year resident of the city. 7 of those have been spent on the south side. I've served in various capacities on my civic association board, and the recurring theme that has arisen over the years is that residents aren't feeling heard, and they're not feeling that they're being represented. I haven't always agreed with the issues on which they specifically don't feel heard or represented, but that's beside the point. The point is that in order to ensure we're continuing to develop a more equitable city, we need to ensure our residents are being represented. I've had to explain to residents on all sides of the political party aisle why developments were approved while there was such strong community opposition. Our community is asking to have more of a voice as our neighborhood changes and grows. We're asking for a change, and we're desperate for a change. The issues faced by residents of downtown are different than those faced by residents in North Linden, and those are different than residents facing issues on the south side or in the Hilltop. So with that being said, it's critical to have people from districts elect their representative. If City Council knows they need to raise $250,000 to win citywide, we'll see a system that continues to favor big moneyed interests over the concerns of our residents. I also think it's critical to lay out key principles for fair districts for the committee tasked with redrawing the districts. In order to prevent gerrymandering, we must ensure there is an equal population in each district and that we're not splitting racial and ethnic minority communities. Excuse me. Contemporaneously, we must respect geographic boundaries and also preserve communities of social, cultural, ethnic, economic, and religious interest. These districts must also be competitive. Incumbent leaders appointing the individuals who would be tasked with drawing the district boundaries under the apportionment proposal is problematic in the public eye. And Council, I urge you in an effort to bring equity to our city to engage community leaders and reiterate commitment to transparency, involve the area commissions and civic associations as much as possible, as well as other community leaders in the process of drawing these district lines. Examine options that engage the community leaders who have fought for their neighborhoods over the years. It's crucial to ensure the people of the city have a seat at this table that is more than symbolic, and the representatives on the commission must represent the people they're serving. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kayla. Next, any questions for Ms. Merchant? Next, I would like to invite Mr. David Green to the podium. Mr. Green, just the friendly reminder, name, 3 minutes, and any organization that you may represent.
Hello, my name is David Green. I'm actually from Bexley, but Columbus influences me, so I was here, and I felt that I should put in my 2 cents. My address is 806 Francis Avenue, and that's in Bexley. And I've lived in Columbus on and off for at least 20 years. Columbus has had a variety of problems, and a lot of these problems have resulted from the inability of the city to plan effectively. And I am encouraged by the council looking to better represent its citizens. You'll find that a lot of times citizens complain a lot when they're not represented properly, and it's not a fault of the representative, maybe a fault of the system. So you're exploring this is good. It encourages me to feel that you're open to new ideas. My background's in long-range planning, city planning, and I've worked for at least 25 years in that area for a variety of different cities. And planning always makes things better, long-range planning, especially when it involves citizens. Citizens complain the most when they're not represented, when they feel they're outsiders, when they feel decisions are being made without them. Now, that's pretty obvious, but the process sometimes creates that. And I think you're trying to reduce that conflict. So I think Columbus has had a variety of problems. I think planning would help it, but that's another issue. I think that better representation and planning reduces citizen conflict. And it's impossible to represent such a large city if you're working with such a huge district trying to represent the whole thing. I feel that it's impossible to represent the whole city and get to every area. It's so diverse. Districts should have better results, and I think exploring this encourages me that you're actually attempting to better represent the city, and that's what our goal should be. It shouldn't be one version or another version. It's what works best, and in my experience, the best representation is when you have districts, you have people elected from those districts, and you have a plan strategy, and citizens get to involve themselves in the plan. It's open to the public, and there's citizen participation, and there's a variety of areas that are solved. It's not city departments going out and making rash decisions without a plan. So I think you're on the right track, and this is good, and I hope it works out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate them, your comments, Mr. Green. Our last speaker is Mr. Will Petrick. And again, I'll extend the friendly reminder, name, address, 3 minutes, and any organization that you may represent, sir.
Thanks, Chairman Harden, Councilmember Brown. My name is Will Petrick. I'm here representing Yes We Can Columbus, and my address is 350 East Tompkins, Columbus, Ohio, 43202. I just want to talk to the issue of competitiveness in our elections. The redistricting that has been a push statewide has been a result of gerrymandered districts where we don't have competitiveness in our elections, where the districts are drawn to have safe seats either for Republicans or for Democrats. I see the city of Columbus as a safe seat for incumbents, and so there's just in general a lack of competition in our citywide elections. Actually, specifically, if you think about the city of Columbus, the last time an incumbent lost was 1995. It's over 20 years ago. So that to me just makes it clear that we lack competitions in at-large local elections. The only other city that also has an at-large system of the largest 50 cities is Portland. And Portland's last incumbent to lose was actually 1992, so they have us beat there. But basically, the recommendations of the Charter Review Committee, while they move towards council districts, they increase the size of city council, it actually doesn't do anything to fix that underlying issue of competitiveness if you're still running all at large. And it's been said tonight, residents and communities increasingly feel like their vote and their voice doesn't matter. And elections, it feels like at every level, local, state, national level, like as a citizen, you're like, how do we actually hold our elected officials accountable? And I think if we were to have an elected official that actually represents our district, the one way to hold them accountable is to actually elect another person if they don't, see to the needs of the community. So I think about, the effort in the short north around the parking proposal. That's, Wineland Park, it's Italian Village, it's Victorian Village, it's South Campus. There's a number of residents who are really concerned about the quality of life in their neighborhood. If they were represented by one council member, they might actually have the opportunity to hold that council member accountable during an election. In an at-large election, again, big moneyed interests really make it not competitive. The same can be said, I know the former speaker talked about how do we engage residents in the planning process. The University Area Commission came up with this university area plan, and it actually limited the height of new development. And the Old North came together. I was a part of this struggle where renters, homeowners, students, older folks, small business people, everyone came together because we were frustrated and because we felt like this development was disrespectful to the history and the spirit of the neighborhood. But at the end of the day, that one developer basically won out. And, again, if we had one council member who was, their election and their political future was at stake, we might see some more movement around codifying that university area plan. So I just want to lift up those clear examples. We've had someone from the south side, someone from the hilltop. So many neighborhoods don't feel like they're being heard, and I worry that this will, on the face of it, look like a positive step, and it is a step in the right direction, but that underlying issue, I think we still need to address.
Thank you. Any questions?
It's not really a question. I think it's a quandary with governance structures and representation structures that, to your point about whether the Old North or the Short North examples that you gave. So in those instances, if those neighborhoods felt that their one elected official, the one person they were allowed to vote on, didn't do right by them, they could unelect that person, right? They could vote for someone else at the next cycle. But the 6 to 8 other council members who serve on city council are totally unaccountable to them. So, I mean, I do think, and I don't expect you to have an answer, that's why it's not a question. I think it's a bit of an existential question about representation models, because right now, any resident of the city, and I feel this all the time because I'm a council member, any resident of the city, no matter where they live, comes to me and comes to every one of my colleagues and advocates for us to vote a certain way. And, that means I'm in all sorts of places in the city talking about zoning issues and understanding that resident's perspective versus them having just one person to call and listen to them. And that's really what district representation does. Again, I see the benefits and I understand what you're saying about smaller, more achievable sizes for candidates running, but I also see the downsides to that neighborhood when they wouldn't be able to lobby unanimous votes, let alone majority votes. So, again, not a question.
I know that at least on some city councils where they have districts, there's basically kind of an unwritten agreement that, you know, if your members that you're accountable to in your district are frustrated and want to see a change, that basically that person who's representing them, the other council members say, okay, we're going to trust you as their representative to speak in the best interest of their district, and we will, you know, basically be in alignment and go with what you're talking about. So I know that that's, at least in some cities, there is kind of an unspoken agreement about that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Petrick. Speaking of more speaking, this does not in this conversation. I think that tonight's hearing really does show that this is a conversation that folks can approach from different sides. I think that, you know, as a community, we have had the conversations about wards and districts and representation. We had a vote last year about specific ward representation, and and it was soundly defeated. I think that this proposal, I remember I wrote an op-ed last year saying that regardless, what we needed was conversation about how we move forward and how we bring more people to the conversation. This is that very process. This is the conversation that we're having. Friends have concerns because they think that this is a conversation that we've had and ended. Foes, or not foes, but folks who have different views say that they want more, or want different type of change. But the good thing is that we're all talking. We're all around the table. We're trying to figure out what's best for our city as we continue to grow and as we continue to move forward. That's what I'm committed to as a council member. I think that's what my colleagues have been extremely committed to exploring throughout this process. And for that, to council members, I appreciate your willingness to engage on this. It is a weighty subject. It is an important subject. It is fundamental to how we govern ourselves. And so I appreciate the folks who showed up this evening. We will have a roundtable discussion on all things charter review July 5th at 5:30 p.m. at the Public Health Department. I think that's 240 East Parsons Avenue, where we will break out and have very, very specific conversations about different pieces of this complex puzzle. Encourage folks to continue to engage, and encourage folks to go back online and to review the conversations of the charter review. It's hard to kind of go through all the different conversations and discussions in a short public hearing, but I think that there is about at least a good day worth of public hearing conversations and feedback that you can go through at your leisure, and then bring those questions and comments to the roundtable discussions on the 5th. Again, thank you, Councilmember Brown, Councilmember Cinziano, council members that I know have their staffs here, Edward Johnson, Director of Legislative Affairs, for jumping head first into this topic, and for being a leader on this. Certainly the City Attorney's Office for your advisement, and certainly Mayor Ginther's office for their support. And lastly, I started by saying thank you to the people who came out and spoke tonight, but I'll end there. You could be other places, but you thought it was worth being here talking about the future of our city. And for that, I say thank you. That concludes this hearing.